Thanks.
All right. Penny, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to be with you today and to talk about burnout. I'm going to be sharing with you some of what I have found as I've been studying burnout over the past 10 years or so. But I want to start by sharing a little bit of my story and how I came to be doing this work. So I am Penny Perri. I'm a life and leadership coach. I'm based in New Hampshire. I have an office in Concord. I work with people all over the world, though, over Zoom. So I have a nice mix of in-person and virtual clients. Um, Before this chapter of my career, I was an EAP counselor. If you're familiar with employee assistance programs, they're very prevalent in the healthcare world. So I was a counselor in an EAP program, a very highly utilized internal EAP in the Concord Hospital Health System here in New Hampshire. And then I became the director of that program and spent the last 10 years of that career as the director. And like all of you, I'm sure I went through some very challenging times in my job during the pandemic. And at that time, I was the director of Concord Hospital EAP, leading a staff of 5 counselors. And our sole mission, of course, was to support the well-being of the healthcare workers in our system. And on that staff of 5 counselors, 2 of my staff were over 60 years of age with underlying health conditions, and 2 of them were pregnant. So you can imagine that I was really, really scared about one of them being in harm's way, any of them. And I also had 3 teenagers at home. And so I quickly found that I really needed to be much more intentional and deliberate with the way that I was managing my own mind, managing my decision making, and frankly, attending to the terror that I was feeling on a regular basis. It was mostly terror about making a mistake, making a decision that would cause harm to one of my staff, one of my kids, the people that I cared about, the people that I served. And also in that larger sense of working in a health system and seeing all of our population of healthcare workers, what they were sort of rising to the occasion of, and trying to figure out how do we support them in this new landscape. And the tool that I found that helped me immensely during that time and ended up being transformational for me was coaching. And so from there, I decided to become a coach, and I ultimately started this practice. And as I'm sure you know, there are many different kinds of coaches. There are wellness coaches, executive coaches, and I do some executive coaching, but I knew that I really wanted to focus on burnout because in my years as director of that EAP, I had seen so much burnout from the people that I was supporting, from my team. I'd experienced it myself. We all know that before the pandemic, burnout was an epidemic in healthcare. So, as I said before, this presentation is going to be a kind of a synthesis of everything I learned in my own experience and in my research, trying to impact burnout on the individual level, the team level, and the organizational level. And I hope that you will come away from this with some actionable steps, some actionable ideas that you can use in your own work. And I invite you to take in this information in whatever way is most useful to you today, whether that's on an individual level or for your team or for your organization. So let's start with a definition of burnout. For this, we can turn to a couple of people. Herbert Freudenberger and Christina Maslach were a couple of the pioneers of the research on burnout in the 1970s. And I always like to highlight this phrase from Christina Maslach, an erosion of the soul. I think that that really captures burnout. It's so resonant, right? It captures the insidiousness of burnout. Burnout is something that we don't see sneaking up on us until it's actually there. Just like we aren't able to perceive the individual grains of sand, say on Rye Beach or Cape Cod, but then we come back after a couple of years and the landscape has changed. Burnout operates in a similar way. We're doing okay. Maybe we're run down a little bit, but we're fine. We're fine. We're doing okay. We keep soldiering on. And then one day we are unrecognizable to ourselves. And I want to talk about how that happens. So the World Health Organization has been paying a lot more attention to burnout recently. And in 2019, they really began, began communicating about it in a much more robust, deliberate way. And they use the definition that was originally coined by Herbert Freudenberger in the 70s. And there are three main symptoms of burnout: emotional exhaustion, disengagement, or kind of a cynicism about our work or the task at hand, and then a sort of a creeping up sense of personal disempowerment, a reduced sense of efficacy. And it's important to note that it happens in that order. So originally you feel, or at the start of it, you feel the exhaustion. And so you think, I'm just tired. That's certainly something that we all feel on a regular basis. But the emotional exhaustion associated with burnout is not alleviated by simple rest. And so that is a real warning sign when you feel exhausted and rest doesn't really touch it. From there, the disillusionment starts to take hold. And then the last symptom to come on the scene is when we start to make burnout about ourselves and we start to feel less effective, like we don't have it anymore. We can't cut it anymore. There's usually some version of that story where we just don't feel like ourselves anymore. And so burnout, first of all, let me just be clear, because a lot of times there's so much of a kind of a blaming of ourselves with burnout. Burnout is not a character flaw. It is not an identity. It is a type of injury from exposure to chronic stress. And it is a prolonged response to chronic stress that manifests in these three symptoms. You feel emotionally exhausted, you feel disengaged, disillusioned, and you feel disempowered. So we've been talking about burnout a lot in recent years, right? It's all over the cultural conversation. It's such a theme, but we haven't really been able to move the needle on burnout, especially in industries like healthcare. And the most recent numbers from the CDC are from 2022, where they were sounding the alarm about a mental health crisis in healthcare. And at that time, they were looking at almost half of healthcare workers reporting feeling burned out. Another part of the picture is that people in leadership roles are feeling burned out across industries like healthcare and those sort of essential worker industries. So burnout isn't going anywhere, and we don't seem to be affecting the rising trajectory of the incidence of burnout. And I want to talk about why that is. Why aren't we getting anywhere in preventing it or in impacting its incidence? Certainly in an industry like healthcare, the forces that are impacting the experience of the work in healthcare, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, they are enormous and vast and very fluid and ever changing. So it's hard to know where to intervene or how to intervene. It just feels like a storm within a storm within a storm, right? But let me pose another theory about the place that we lose our footing in the fight against burnout. This is what I have been witnessing since before the pandemic in trying to impact burnout at the individual, team, and organizational level. Too often, any conversation about burnout lands in one of these two places, or it toggles back and forth between these two things, shame and blame. Now, why is that? Well, any discussion of burnout, if you're anywhere near it, it elicits negative emotions, right? It's awful to feel burnout, and it's also very hard to witness it in your colleagues. In this place of negative emotions, our human brain, it tends to get judgy. That's just a natural sort of a protective response. And so our brain kind of automatically goes looking for fault, trying to figure out whose fault it is. It's us or it's them. It's that I can't cut it, or it's the system. We tend to land in one of those two places. And shame, of course, is one of the most intolerable feelings we can have as human beings, and we are not going to hang out there for very long. Blame, on the other hand, is kind of the psychological equivalent of the donuts in the break room. It is tempting, and there's a sort of a sugar high satisfaction to it for a while, especially when we're venting with our colleagues or our coworkers. But then we're left with the crash, and we feel helpless and hopeless again. So neither one of these two places, shame or blame, leads to any actionable solutions. This thinking not only doesn't solve the problem, it leads to more burnout. And I want to call out this false dichotomy that forms, I think, here. The notion becomes, if I'm addressing my burnout as an individual, then there's this sense that I'm letting everything else off the hook, the stressors, the workplace, the demands, whatever I'm perceiving as unfair or broken. And so this thinking happens naturally in any situation where we adopt this stance of, oh, I don't need to change. It's the other person or the situation that needs to change. And again, there's this sort of righteous satisfaction there that I'm placing responsibility squarely where it needs to rest. I'm holding something accountable or someone accountable. But of course, it doesn't work that way. That is a lose-lose proposition. So what I like to do at this point is ask people a very practical question, which is this: how long do you want to wait to feel better? Here's the thing. If we continue to ignore our own needs as a matter of principle and redirect all our energy to railing against whatever we see as the quote unquote system, We're signing up for a very long game whose pace is often glacial. We'll be banging our already exhausted heads up against a brick wall, which of course perpetuates the burnout. This binary thinking is a trap, and it is also a symptom. It's black and white thinking. The place of healing burnout requires that we all step outside of the false dichotomy to a place of dual responsibility, beyond shame and blame. Acceptance of something, however unfair it feels, acceptance of reality is not approval. And as organizational psychologist Adam Grant says, burnout is everyone's problem. One of the most important words in the discussion of burnout is this word "and." Two seemingly contradictory things can exist and be true at the same time. We do need to heal ourselves, and we need to change our workplaces. We need to take care of what's happening inside of us, and we need to address the system at large. If you're feeling burned out, it is not your fault, and it's your privilege to do whatever you can to take care of yourself and heal. And who is ultimately going to influence the systems that are so in need of change and overhaul? The people who work inside of them. For the sake of analogy, I think it's helpful to look at a physical injury like carpal tunnel syndrome. It's often a workplace injury caused by the chronic stress, strain, and pressure placed on the median nerve. Over time, the stress placed on this nerve cannot be successfully managed, and the nerve becomes damaged. Here's the thing, when we look at carpal tunnel, what do we do when someone discovers they have it? Well, first of all, we don't get mired in shame and blame about it, right? An injury occurred. The work environment contributed to the injury, and we can look at what interventions can be made for both the environment and the individual to heal and prevent further injury. There are workplace interventions that can help. We could get a more ergonomically appropriate keyboard to prevent further damage. But here's the thing, we don't expect that new keyboard to reverse the damage that's already been done. We must attend to the injury itself with varying levels of intervention depending on how significant it's gotten. The same is true of burnout. We need to think of burnout as an injury. We need to think about what sort of interventions will heal that injury and what can prevent it from getting any further. The other thing that makes burnout difficult to identify and manage is that it is often hard to distinguish it from simple stress. So let me just talk about that for a minute. Of course, stress is a natural and normal response to perceived threats and demands in our environment. We experience it in big and small ways on a regular basis. And stress is not inherently bad for us. On the contrary, stress gives us important signals about what's happening in our world, and it can activate us into a response. But here's what I want you to think about. Many of us, especially those of us who are wired to serve, wired to overachieve, wired to lead and care for others, we can find that at some point in our lives, the accumulation of responsibility and demands of our work in the world and the volatility and complexity of the world we navigate, it has resulted in levels of stress and a multiplicity of stressors that outpaces our ability to manage. This is the point where burnout happens. And while stress feels like a power switch being thrown, burnout feels like a slow, gradual dimming of our inner light. While stress levels rise and fall in a normal day, burnout sort of gets inside of us. Burnout affects our thinking and it affects our sense of identity. Again, this is where our actual best qualities can work against us. If you're like many of my clients, your impulse is just to push on and soldier through. You hope it'll improve on its own, that some change will come along and make things better. All the while, you sort of feel trapped in this limbo where you're wondering if you should make a change, wondering how long you can keep doing this. And in my experience, this is a recipe for more burnout. So this is the point at which I have to pause and talk about the elephant in the room. And if you're working in healthcare, I'm going to guess that you know what I'm talking about. You know the word that cannot be uttered in a healthcare setting without a chorus of eye rolls and immediate dismissiveness. Yes, that word is resilience. Let's be clear here. Burnout does not occur because of a lack of resilience. On the contrary, many of the most burned out people right now have also been the most high functioning. They are the ones with the passion. They are the stars. They are the go-to employees. They're the ones we always look to and depend on. Their resilience got them through grad school. It got them through medical school. It got them propelled up the ladder in their career. And now they're being told they need resilience training. Of course, that is not going over well. There has also grown up in the last several years a $1 billion quote unquote wellness industry that is all about self-care. And that is another thing that people are really pushing back on right now because, of course, advertisers have kind of co-opted that phrase to convince us to buy things. And so there's a real cynicism about resilience and self-care, and I think rightfully so. As one doctor put it, you can keep your yoga mat and give me more time with my patients. I get it. The turbulence and disruption of the last several years has left a landscape for which we have no map. We are resilient, and yet we were not prepared for this. You're fit enough to run a 5K every day, but it turns out every other Thursday they threw in a double Ironman. And the fix is certainly not as simple as deep breathing and bubble baths. I'm a huge fan of both of those things, but they are not going to heal or prevent burnout in the current climate. And still, many of us find that the resilience and the stress hardiness that enabled us to get to this point in our lives is not serving us in the same way anymore. The armor that you developed early in your career now feels like a prison. The go-to coping mechanisms can leave you feeling shut down and numb. So what if burnout is a signal? It is not a symptom of a lack of resilience. It is a signal. It is the canary in the coal mine telling us that, yes, the system needs to change and we need to change too. I love to show this quote at this point where we kind of turn the corner on this idea about lack of resilience, because this is the truth that I have come to know, that we continually in this human life are called to transform and evolve. And burnout can be just that call for transformation, just that call for evolvement, growth, and development. To know ourselves more deeply, to understand the shadow side of our strengths, to gain insight into our default patterns, and to connect more deeply to our purpose. And burnout is also a signal for our workplaces. We can't just tell the canary to be tougher and then send it back into the mine. Our workplaces, our leadership needs to evolve as well. On a personal level, we learn at some point that no matter how far we go in this life, it still wants to teach us things, right? Again and again, it comes knocking, demanding that we learn. It's sort of the only option. Life demands more wisdom and strength from us. It demands that we continue to find our invincible summer again and again and still again. And Freud talked about love and work as sort of the two pillars of our lives. Our closest relationships to our loved ones and our life's work. Those are the two polarities that we continue to evolve toward. And so, of course, our relationship to our work would be as complex and evolving as any other relationship in our lives. So what if taking care of our own burnout is not some sort of tacit acquittal of all those stressors? What if it's the foundation from which we become sort of the next more effective version of ourselves and a more influential agent of change? At this point, I want to introduce you to a model that I created to help understand burnout and how it happens. So any of you Stephen Covey fans out there, I bet you quickly recognize these three circles, these three concentric circles, because I adapted this model from Stephen Covey's circles of concern, which he showed us in his masterwork, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, back in 1989. So I took that model and I adapted it to talk about burnout. So when you look at the outermost circle, the largest circle, I want you to imagine that that is the container for all the stressors, all the things, all the demands, the lack of resources, the work environment. It wouldn't take you long to fill up that outer circle with all of the things that you experience as stressors. The middle sphere, that blue sphere, I'm calling that the interface, because an interface is where two systems meet and interact with each other. And then this is the place where all of the things out in that stressor environment kind of meet you and you experience them. This is also where you try to impact that environment. This is where energy gets exchanged, and burnout is all about energy. So you take in energy through that blue sphere and you give your energy. That's very important. So looking at burnout this way, you can see how the syndrome takes hold. The more you feel frustrated and drained by the stressors in that outer circle, The more you think about them, the more you send all your energy to them, and the more disempowered you feel. It's sort of a constant, never-ending argument with reality. And one of the fallacies of our thinking, even just on a good day, but especially when we're experiencing burnout, is that we feel like we need to change our stressors in order to feel better. We need someone else to behave differently. We need to change careers. We need a complete overhaul of some part of our lives. And this kind of thinking, because we in fact cannot control directly any of those things, this kind of thinking leads us right back to our symptoms, feeling exhausted, powerless, and disconnected, disengaged. So if we imagine the idea of burnout as a stress injury, it takes place in that blue sphere, in that interface. And just like a physical injury, if it's left unmanaged over time, it will sort of affect other systems. And so what happens is that burnout starts here in this interface where we exchange energy with the world, where we interact with the world. But what happens is over time, it goes here to our core. And our core is our cognitive, emotional, physical, spiritual being. It is the dimensions of ourself, our being, and our well-being that gets affected by burnout. So you may become shut down, unable to connect with others in the way that you once did. You may feel like your boundaries are non-existent, like there's just a kind of a siphon sucking the life out of you whenever you try to work with your population or address anything in your work. That is because this interface has become damaged. You no longer have a healthy interface, which is kind of flexible and permeable. You can let in the good things. You can take in that positive energy from your environment, and you can hold on to the energy you need. When that interface is damaged, you don't have that healthy flow of energy in and out. And as it is with so many living things, the hallmark of health is balance and flexibility. So when we think about how burnout happens and how we might heal it, we want to think about repairing that interface. Let's take a look at the model in a different way. What if you are in a position where you have some influence on those stressors in that large outer circle? If you lead an organization, if you lead a team, if you're in a position where you support or consult with or influence those leaders, maybe you can make an impact on some of those stressors so that you can start to fight burnout at that level. And drawing upon the literature, these are the chief drivers of burnout, in the workplace environment. These are the places where, if you have some control over these things, affecting change here could make a difference in people's experience of the work and therefore their burnout. Of course, workload is right up there at the top, right? No one's surprised at that, but here's what I want to emphasize. Workload is not the only lever that you have to pull. I think that's really important because a lot of times what I hear in organizations is a discussion about workload and how intractable it is, how hard it is to change the sort of demands and resources ratio And so it just feels futile and the conversation ends there. There are several different drivers of burnout that really matter. And I want to just highlight a couple of them here. Control is huge. Think about how important our sense of control is to us as human beings. Just imagine yourself riding a roller coaster right now, and you can feel how important our sense of control is to our nervous system in real time. So think about the ways that you can help people feel more autonomy and control over their daily experience of their work. This can dramatically impact burnout. Community and culture is another hugely impactful arena to look at to impact burnout. Even if the workload is really tough, our sense of existing in a healthy, positive, supportive, honest culture can be so protective against burnout. Connection is it's sort of the gold standard of medicine for burnout. So if you are in a leadership role, having a conversation with your people about these issues, making it a priority, showing that these things matter, this can be really impactful for burnout. We don't have time in this presentation to really go do a deep dive into all of these things, but to lead a conversation about just bringing up these items or a couple of them and getting a sense of people's experience, what matters to them, that is how you start the process. And this doesn't happen often. Why? I understand it. I was a leader myself. It can feel like you're opening Pandora's box because you don't have all the answers. These are huge things, every one of them. And we often feel as leaders like we have to have all the answers. But here's what I want to say to you. These conversations are happening whether you're leading them or not. Wouldn't you rather participate in these conversations and help shape the narrative and fact check the rumor mill? Wouldn't you rather show caring concern about these things and lead a transparent process of trying to affect change, however incremental it could be? This is enough. This is enough. You don't have to change everything. You don't have to have all the answers. But often what we do is we avoid it altogether. It's like an untouchable thing that is not spoken about in actual meetings. And then of course it gets talked about in the meeting after the meeting. So I love to support leaders in really creating a process where they can participate with their people in a process of intentional and consistent, deliberate thinking together about this and changing what can be changed, however small, however incrementally. This is really the way to make it happen. I want you to think about perhaps your relationship with your own leader and how much that would matter to you and how you wouldn't need them to have all the answers, but how it would feel for them to have a genuine, caring conversation with you about these things in your work experience. What you're doing in this process, without all the answers, you are injecting a couple of very psychologically protective ingredients: connection, optimism, and hope. And you may also be building trust if you can follow up regularly. Now let's zoom back to the individual. I really believe if you are experiencing symptoms of burnout right now, then you want to start here Even if you're just seeing it out on the horizon, the best way to take care of burnout is to be preventative about it. And how many times when you've needed to do hard things physically, have you been advised to strengthen your core? The same is true with burnout. It comes back to your core, to your center, to your cognitive, emotional, social, physical, and spiritual well-being. And depending on the level of burnout that has set in, depending on how long it's been there, people may need to enlist the support of a coach, a counselor, a therapist, a group, a mentor. Personally, I have created a course and coaching program to help people prevent and overcome burnout. I personally believe that coaching is an ideal intervention for burnout because coaching tools address the experience of the work in real time. Yes, there are things that we can do outside of work to rest and repair and to mitigate the effects, but I don't think that's enough for many people in healthcare in the current environment. So bringing coaching tools to your actual experience, to your relationship of the work can be so very helpful. And currently I'm offering group coaching to both groups of physicians, providers, clinicians, and also leaders, because these groups are really missing a lot of that collegial connection that used to be built in when our workplaces operated differently and looked different. And so we're trying to infuse that connection, which is such an important part of the healing from burnout. And I want to share some research with you that's really promising. So there's an article that's from October of last year from the Journal of the American Medical Association that looked at the results of a very large randomized clinical trial of over 1,000 women trainee physicians. Half of them participated in an online group coaching program, and half of them did not. And after 4 months, in all the scales measuring burnout, moral injury, imposter syndrome, as well as looking at self-compassion and flourishing, the results were not only statistically significant, they were incredibly compelling and promising. And it's exciting to me because I happen to have been trained at the same coaching program that these physician coaches participated in, and I'm using the same tools in my program. So there's some really solid evidence out there in the research that coaching makes a big, big difference. Now, I want to leave you with a couple of really important places that you can look at for your own prevention of burnout and perhaps your own recovery if you're feeling burnout. These are things that have to do with your experience of your daily work that you have some control over. They don't entirely reside in that outer circle. And they are the most potent antidotes that you can truly get your arms around to change your experience of your work. If you can impact any of these aspects of your experience, these are going to offer you the most bang for your buck in repairing that interface and alleviating burnout or preventing it from worsening. These are your sense of control. Remember, we talked about that before. Your sense of meaning, your sense of connection with others, and your sense of daily progress. So these are really great places to begin resetting your GPS if you're feeling that's needed to protect yourself against burnout. And we access these things most easily by actively coaching ourselves. I want to give you a little bit of a tool before we wrap up here. So these brains of ours, these human brains, They really need us to be supervising them. My teacher used to say they're like toddlers with scissors. They really need supervision. So how do you do that? How do you kind of eavesdrop on and supervise your own brain? Well, first of all, you turn your attention a little bit more to it. That would be a really great place to start instead of continually putting your attention to that outer sphere of the things you can't control. Let's try bringing it back to your own brain and how it is narrating your experience to you. And then I want you to notice the questions you're asking yourself. So often we will ask ourselves questions that are, let's just say they're not very high quality. We are often saying things like, I wonder what fresh hell awaits me in this meeting. Or what's wrong with him? What's wrong with me? Why can't so and so just fill in the blank, right? We have all of these very, very negative, very futile questions that if we leave ourselves on default, our brain will offer us. A great way to change your experience very potently, very powerfully, immediately is to ask yourself better questions. I had a client who is a managing partner of a very busy pediatric practice. And as she was driving to work, the question she was asking herself usually went something like this. I wonder what I'm going to have to fix today. I wonder what disaster, what fire I'm going to have to put out today. This was her default narrative on the way to work. It was creating stress before she even got in the door. It was putting her into it was creating the rabbit hole, right? Because then what happens is when we ask our brain a question like that, we just seek evidence for it. That's what our brain is designed to do. So one of the things that we worked on was really becoming more deliberate, intentional with the questions that she asked herself as she drove to work. She started to calibrate and give herself real clarity about what was most important and what wasn't important. That's a really big one too. What was she going to let go of, and where was she putting her focus? That helped her with her sense of control. For meaning and connection, she asked herself, I wonder what little cuties I'm going to help today. I wonder what little cuties I'm going to help today. Sounds like kind of a silly little question, but it immediately changed her sense of meaning because that's what her work was all about for her. Those little cuties that she got to help and work with. It was changing the emotional landscape of her ride to work and setting herself up with a different mindset for her day. This, of course, just scratches the surface, but I'm hoping that this gives you a glimpse of the way that you can begin to control this very important experience and your relationship to the work. A sense of daily progress is hugely important now because we are all interacting with these systems that we have created that are so efficient at shoveling work at us. Email, the EMR. We have these enormous, machine learning systems that are much more efficient than we are as human beings. And we are setting ourselves up for such a sense of failure constantly when we don't get more intentional about what our daily progress can reasonably look like. So at the end of each day, taking a moment to ask yourself and to witness for yourself what you were able to accomplish, what is actually enough, where things stand, and what's reasonable to expect with email and the other big electronic systems. That is a place where you can also get a handle on more of a sense of positive control over your work. So invite you to really intentionally point your brain in directions that are going to help you when it comes to your sense of control, when it comes to meaning, when it comes to connection. When's the last time you had a real connection with a colleague? When's the last time you sat down face to face with somebody that you cared about at work? Make sure these things are happening. They matter. They are medicine for burnout. I want to leave you with just some options and resources for further reading if you want a deeper dive into this work. These are some of the sources that I used, and they are also opportunities for you to be able to learn more. And finally, I want to invite you to reach out. I'd love to stay in touch. This is all my contact information. I have a website. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram, though I'm not much of a social media person. I'd love for you to shoot me an email or visit my website. And I have a newsletter that comes out monthly if you would like to get on that mailing list and stay in touch. I really appreciate you being here with me today, and I'd love to answer any questions that came up during the presentation in the last few minutes that we have.
Thanks, Penny. Let me change this. I can figure out how to do this. Change so everybody, so people can unmute. Right. If you've got a question, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, and I'll kind of help manage the Q&A. Well, let me ask Penny. Can you share at least your contact information and the slide with the further reading so I can share that with the group? That be
Absolutely. I'm happy to share my slides.
so? Any questions for Penny? I'm just gonna